Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the beautiful Martin Luther King Jr. Library. Isn't she lovely? Let me thank Rich Reyes Gavlin, who's here. Rich? Thank you, Rich. I want to thank you for your wonderful vision for working with the outstanding team of employees at DC Public Libraries to open this beautiful facility. Mr. Chairman, members of the council, members of my cabinet, I want to thank you too for all of your hard work over the last year plus that we have worked together hand in hand to fight this pandemic, to keep DC residents safe, to help our businesses, and now to invest in our continued relief, recovery, and the growth of Washington, D.C. So give yourselves a round of applause. Never has the phrase been more true that we are all in this together. I think this pandemic has taught us that incredible lesson. But today we're here to talk about the money and how we are together going to invest it. I don't have to tell you, nor our residents who are watching, that the financial impact of COVID has required us to make some sacrifices while maintaining the critical services our residents expect and invest in protecting our most vulnerable residents. We have taken extraordinary steps over the last year plus to reduce spending, access our reserves, maximize the use of federal aid, and respond to the negative impacts of the pandemic. You will remember, of course, that our budget team had to produce 2 budgets last year in about 3 weeks' time. You had to call special meetings, adjust your schedule to consider those budgets. And this week we come to you again a little bit later than normal, and we appreciate that you have made that time available for all of the federal resources to be considered thoughtfully. Our FY22 budget proposal, in this proposal we are using significant federal investments to provide relief, recovery, and growth opportunities, and invest in an equitable recovery across all 8 wards. Our COVID response, as you know, has included 2.6 million meals delivered across 85 sites, including 300,000 meals for DC seniors. Our rental assistance programs have provided so far $74.5 million in rental assistance. Remote learning, we turned on a dime and connected 11,000 students to free internet. Our unemployment benefits, we have delivered $2+ billion in additional and local benefits to DC workers. We have provided, I think, a first-in-class testing and vaccination program. Over 550,000 COVID-19 free tests have been administered and 660,000 vaccination doses. We hired 420 contract tracers, and we provided local stimulus to 9,000 residents, including a $1,200 supplemental payment. In small business investments locally, we provided $155 million in business grants, including the Bridge Fund, COVID-19 micro grants, child center grants, and much more. We should all be very proud that we have weathered the financial impacts of COVID. In fact, because of the strong stewardship of our resources for all of us around the table, We have balanced 25 budgets, achieved the AAA bond rating and maintained it, fully funded our pensions. We have strong reserves, and our real estate market continues to be strong. We have also, and I want to thank all of the directors behind me and around me because they did some tough but smart work in targeting reductions to agency spending, made strategic investments to use available reserves, and maximize the use of federal funds. This has allowed us over the course of the last year to avoid more drastic cuts to our valuable public services. I am heartened in all of my visits around the city. People stop me, literally stop me, to thank DC government for all that DC government workers have been able to do. So we are the representatives of 37,000 people, many of which reported in person every day of this pandemic to keep the city running. So please give them a round of applause. And the chairman will be pleased to know that we maintain a strong financial foundation in this budget for our future growth. We invest in our high priority needs to solve our city's biggest issues. District revenues, just to give you a sense of where we've been during this pandemic and how we're turning the corner. Last September, we saw a dip in our revenues of $742 million, $742 million. This May, we're up $217 million. This is a testament to DC businesses. We've also seen a drop in the number of our unemployment claims, and those numbers continue to go down as well. Last September, we had 0 vaccines. This May, we have 3 approved FDA vaccines for every person 12 years old and older. Last September, of course, no one was vaccinated. In this May, we have 50% of our residents fully vaccinated and nearly 70% with at least 1 dose. I'll pause there because there's work to do. And if we want to get back to normal and we don't want to lose the gains that we've made, we have to work double hard to make sure that people are getting vaccinated. We also saw when we look at consumer spending and restaurant spending, we were down last September 41% and 49% respectively. And now we are still down, but we're not down as much. 17% and 26% for consumer and restaurant spending. Last September, we were still pretty much in a limited opening posture. And now by June 11th, we'll be pretty much fully open when it comes to our capacity limits and other restrictions. And everyone has been watching the cicadas. They're here. Last September, we were just talking about them. So let me just say a couple of final things before I turn it over to the city administrator and Director Reed to talk about some specifics in this budget. We focused on a few pillars. Obviously, there's a lot to do, and we've grouped a lot of our activities in this budget. We must support residents and businesses that have been most impacted by COVID-19. We've been doing that throughout, and that's also important for their growth and recovery. We must build and preserve more affordable housing for our residents. That goes, we talked a lot about that this week, and we're going to continue to talk about it throughout this process. We must reduce gun violence. Our residents, our children, our family deserve to be safe. And we must help students accelerate their learning and get back to the classroom ready to grow. We have to reduce health inequities. We've seen the ravages of COVID and the disparate outcomes in our city, but those outcomes relate to disparate health outcomes that predated COVID. So we have to continue to invest in that, and we have to create a stronger and more inclusive economy. So with that, I want to introduce Jenny Reed, who is the mayor's budget director. Jenny leads a performance and budget team that has done incredible work over the last year, including on 3 budgets, but as well as supporting DCHCMA, the Office of the Senior Advisor, in making sure that the monies that we get and then the monies that we're owed, that we're getting those. So Jenny, I'm going to thank you and your team for that hard work. I also want to turn to City Administrator Kevin Donahue, who's going to lead us off in this discussion. I'll have very short words to say after that, and we'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mayor, and good morning.
But Kevin, before you start, should I pause? Mr. Chairman, did you want to make opening remarks?
Sure. Thank you, Mayor Bowser, and thank you everybody who's here. I sort of feel like I'm interrupting the presentation, but I welcome the opportunity. First, I want to say thank you for asking to revive this which we haven't done for over a year, I guess for 2 years now. And I think it's good that we're getting together. The 2 branches are getting together as we begin this budget process. I also want to thank you, not that this would have been my first thought, but really bringing us all here to Martin Luther King Library, which has been open but not open. And so here the public is seeing this building, and it's really quite exciting and striking what has happened with this building. And so thank you for that. And I also want to acknowledge that where we are with the pandemic in Washington, D.C. has an awful lot to do with, Mayor Bowser, your policy over the past year, which has been, instead of fighting with the public health officials, to say, no, we're going to follow the science. And so we're at a pretty good place, and that includes a better place economically than we thought we would be a year ago. And so thank you for that. I do want to say now, before we get through the presentation and then council members will have questions, that our schedule is one where you will be formally presenting this budget to the council next Wednesday. I believe it's at noon. And we've done that every year, and if I remember correctly, we'll follow the same format in the past. You'll be present for 1 round of questions from members, and the city administrator will be, we will hold him hostage for at least a second round of questions. During the month of June, the council committees will be having hearings. That schedule's already been published on the council's website, and it's a pretty intense month of hearings, but anybody who's interested in a particular agency, you can go to the council's website, see when that budget hearing will be, and you can sign up to testify. We have 54 days between today and when our first vote is, which will be July 20th, and that's because that's what the statute requires. The committees will begin their markup on June 30th, if I remember correctly, so they're like 2 days, maybe 3 days that week when the committees will be doing their markups. And between roughly July 1st and July 20th, we will be working out whatever changes we would be making to the budget. I realize that what you send to us is perfect, but the council is always able to make refinements to make it better. And it's an intense process, but it's the process that gets us to a good budget. Before I turn it back to you, I just want to acknowledge that the council members who are here, Councilmember Nadeau from Ward 1, and Councilmember Pinto, Councilmember Che, Councilmember McDuffie, Councilmember Allen, Councilmember Trayon White, Councilmember Bonds, Councilmember Silverman, Councilmember Robert White, and Councilmember Henderson. So thank you for bringing us together. Thank everybody for being here.
Thank you. City Administrator.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm going to set some context around the budget, and then Director Reed and I will go through some individual highlights as part of different policy areas. So the context, as you can see on the slide here, relates to the federal stimulus funding. So this table shows $2.49 or $2.5 billion in federal funding that is part of both the FY21 supplemental budget and the FY22 budget that extends throughout FY22, 23, and 24. So the $2.5 billion is spread across 4 fiscal years, and it's spread into different areas of our city's needs. Affordable housing, $505 million over those 4 years. Economic recovery for businesses, $483 million. Economic recovery for residents, $387 million. Health, $378 million. Learning acceleration, $263 million. Gun violence prevention, $193 million. The COVID-19 response, which is concentrated really in FY21 and 22, at $189 million. Funding for oversight, accountability, and efficiency of the spending of the stimulus funds at $33.6 million. And alternatives to the 9/11 response at $21 million. Some other categories that group about $43 million. So that combines to be $2.5 billion. Now the total federal stimulus is $3.3 billion. There are still areas and direct federal grants to agencies that are still either we are waiting for guidance from the federal government or agencies are developing spend plans. So as I'm going to turn to different areas, and Director Reeder and I will switch off on the areas. The first one is in education. This is not the totality of new investments. We're highlighting some. And I'm going to really talk, unless we say otherwise, about FY22, what you're going to see proposed for next fiscal year. So at the top, you see 3.6% increase in the base amount of the uniform per student funding formula, plus increased weights within that for English language learners and at-risk students. $8 million to expand school-based mental health services to all the remaining DC public and DC public charter schools to have a clinician. That's 83 additional schools. $10 million in additional grants to the charter schools to assist with reopening for full in-person instruction next school year. $13 million in FY22 for high-impact tutoring, an evidence-based approach to accelerating student learning post-pandemic. This $13 million is supplemented by larger amounts that will be individual school-based. So the $13 million is what we're doing centrally. In addition to that, schools will use their own federal funding, it's called ESSER funding, to supplement that amount, that have it be unique to the individual schools. $13 million to provide students access to affordable bachelor's and associate's degrees. $5.6 million to increase access to summer programming with academic enrichment. And $68 million spread across multiple programs to provide to increase access to high quality, affordable childcare and provide incentives and scholarships for early childhood education teachers. More on education here. We wanted to pause because part of the proposal in the budget we submit to you envisions a new high school experience that's meant to enhance post-secondary success by investing in expanding career training opportunities and career experiences while students are still in high school. This will actually start in middle school, if you look on the left here, with $1.9 million to expand early career awareness and exploration programming in middle school. $10 million to create a new advanced technical center that will train students in advanced high-demand, high-earning fields such as nursing and cybersecurity, meant to start with serving 300 to 600 students over 3 years. $6.9 million to support programming to generate interest in the early years of high school and create pathways to career and technical education. And then $3 million to increase SYEP wages to meet the district's minimum wage for students participating in summer internships, and $6.9 million to allow for seniors to have work-based experience, get paid for those internships during the school day while getting academic credit as well.
So Kevin calls this the new high school experience. I just call it new high school. And I think you're going to hear throughout your hearings from the chancellor and public education leaders of what COVID has taught us for our older students. We have made considerable investments, and thank you to the council members for continuing to stay focused on quality child care, pre-K 3 and up. And what we know our parents and students are telling us is they want that middle and high school experience to match those in the early grades. So we think this is going to be a huge investment for public education in the district.
Thank you, Mayor. And we have one more slide highlighting the education investments. Starting with investments recognizing the need for kids as they return in person to be safe as they're going to and from school. This is highlighted by two separate investments. One is $7.2 million in FY22 to promote youth safety initiatives, including a large investment in safe passage and out-of-school activities for youth and enhancing training for school resource officers. The large investment in safe passage will go to community-based organizations to have individuals be staffing, essentially blocks that are part of our safe passage areas as students go to and from school. In addition to that, for schools, both elementary, middle, and high schools that are in safe passage zones in Ward 7 and 8, we are providing shuttles or micro-transit routes that will total $6.1 million that will allow for each principal in each school community to have a shuttle at its disposal to be able to help its kids get to and from school safely. In addition to those programmatic increases, we also are investing heavily in the capital needs of our schools with $1.57 billion over 6 years for school modernizations, small capital projects, and school expansions to address overcrowding and to accelerate Truesdale and Whittier elementary schools, and $420 million over the next 6 years to improve parks, recreation facilities, and libraries. Now, Director Reed's going to talk about some of our investments in health and human services.
Thank you, City Administrator. So I'll speak a little bit about some of the investments in health and human services and how we're shoring up support for some of our most vulnerable residents. Our first investment is $15 million to the Health Benefit Exchange to support small businesses and residents whose health insurance premiums are in arrears as a result of job losses or as a result of slowdowns in their business activity. $12 million will be invested to launch a new pilot called Career Map, which will help working families avoid the benefit cliffs that they fall off as their income rises. This will help supplement some of that loss as they progress throughout their careers and get them to a good place to launch into and off public benefits. $8.4 million to continue our support of the 5 centers of excellence at Howard University Hospital. $8.5 million to support affordable food access through increased funding for senior meals, funding for the Capital Area Food Bank, and increases to the Produce RX program and Nourish DC Fund. $18 million to advance health equity efforts, including the development and opening of a new sobering center to provide residents a safe place to sober up and get connected to services and avoid jail or avoid taking up emergency hospital beds. We'll also expand behavioral health services for clients of the telehealth services, for clients of the Department of Behavioral Health and Department of Disability Services, and then offer doula services for low-income women who cannot access them through Medicaid. $13 million will go to increase supports and services to residents experiencing mental health crises in the Department of Behavioral Health. This is on top of the investments that you'll hear about later on in support for alternatives to 911 or the school-based mental health program we spoke about earlier. $46 million will add 2 new paid family leave benefits to our current paid family leave program. 1, 2 weeks for prenatal medical leave, and second, 2 weeks for persons who are experiencing domestic violence, stalking, or sexual abuse so that they have time to recover. And we certainly would not forget our seniors. So in this budget, we are proposing new investments to provide some senior socialization hubs. These hubs will help provide activities for seniors to get together and socialize outside of the traditional sort of brick and mortar places, and will of course provide additional support to our senior villages to make sure they can connect with residents who might have been increasingly isolated during the pandemic. We will expand transportation access for 1,000 seniors through our Connector Card program that provides discounted transit services, and increase our meal delivery this fiscal year while we're still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. I also want to spend a minute talking about investments in one of the most important priority areas for our city, affordable housing. You heard the mayor earlier this week launch our historic $400 million contribution to the Housing Production Trust Fund, bringing our total contribution to the Housing Production Trust Fund in the mayor's tenure to over $1 billion. This is matched with $42 million of new project and sponsor-based vouchers to make sure that those new units can be deeply affordable to our lowest income residents. $352 million will be invested in rent and utility assistance through our DC Stay DC program that's currently open and accepting applications if you are in need of help. We'll have $17 million for our Housing Preservation Fund, including $5 million to help our limited equity co-ops purchase their buildings. We'll invest $67 million to acquire properties across the district and turn them into affordable housing. This can either be deeply affordable housing, it could be permanent supportive housing, and this $67 million includes $17 million for purchase of emergency housing for our domestic violence victims. $113 million will help renovate and modernize DC Housing Authority properties. This includes both what people consider the traditional Housing Authority properties, as well as investments in our new communities projects. $24 million to help our low-income home buyers purchase their first home. $5 million to restore previously sort of dilapidated or vacant properties in our areas that are experiencing most gun violence. And $1.2 million to expand shelter services for LGBTQ residents who are victims of domestic violence, as well as an increase in shelter access for our transgender residents. And we are also continuing the mayor's historic investments in our Homeward DC program to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. This includes 758 new permanent supportive housing units for single residents and 347 permanent supportive housing units for families. We are expanding our services for individuals in a big way, including expansion of Project Reconnect, which provides one-on-one support to adults imminently at risk of homelessness, shallow subsidies, rapid rehousing, and other supports. And then we'll be investing $102 million to renovate the district's permanent and temporary housing services across the city to make our shelters more welcome and inviting to residents who need help. I'm now going to turn it back over to the city administrator to discuss our investments in public safety.
Thank you, Director. So for public safety, I'm going to go through some of these individual items and highlight them. I want to say that the mayor early this year rolled out the Building Blocks DC initiative, which is meant to really reflect and capture and coordinate activities within city agencies aimed at reducing gun violence. We are increasing those activities for FY22 by $45 million. What you see here, I'll go through some of the highlights of public safety investments. The first is increasing $11 million to support returning citizens with cash assistance, financial coaching, and peer navigations as they transition back into the community. This funding will go to CBOs and will represent a near tripling of the amount that we provide returning citizen direct service organizations. $7.8 million for additional violence interrupters and $400,000 for additional credible messengers. This will translate to 52 additional violence interrupters and 11 caseworkers and case managers, in addition to what we have now. $4.5 million for expanding the DC Pathways programs at the ONES office. That will allow it to serve an additional 100 individuals per year, and $4.1 million to provide additional wraparound services and support new Pathways champions positions for at-risk individuals. $5.6 million to create 110 dedicated employment opportunities at DPW for individuals at risk of gun violence. $1.9 million to expand trauma-informed mental health services. $2.2 million to provide temporary safe housing for residents. This is for residents who have an immediate need to have housing outside of the neighborhood in which they might be at risk. $1.5 million just for community grants to carry out neighborhood action plans in communities hardest hit by gun violence. $6.8 million spread between the Department of Behavioral Health, DDOT, and DPW to respond to non-emergency 911 calls for mental health distress, minor traffic crashes, and parking complaints, and adding 100 new slots to NPD's cadet program with $3.4 million, This will bring that program up to 200 cadets, which will allow that program, when those cadets matriculate, to provide the vast majority of NPD's new hiring. And I'll turn it back to Director Reed for economic recovery.
Thank you, City Administrator. We know that this pandemic has hit some of our residents and businesses harder than others, and so we're making big investments in their economic recovery. So first, for our residents, we are going big on employment and on-the-job training. We'll be investing nearly $50 million in FY22 to dramatically expand our subsidized employment and training programs, adding 2,400 slots for the DC Infrastructure Academy Project Empowerment and WIC partnerships to help get our residents connected to employment. $1.5 million to expand our SolarWorks DC training program to add 75 new training opportunities for residents in this emerging industry. And $4.2 million to add 4,200 slots to our Marion Barry Summer Youth Employment Program that will follow an earn and learn model that will allow students to not only earn wages and gain on the job experience, but also get paid for some of the credit recovery and summer learning experiences that they need to do. This actually also starts this fiscal year as well, and we're pleased to announce that this will be happening in this summer and next summer. We'll also be investing in skills training and career navigation for our residents as they get back into the job market. So we'll provide $6 million for a rapid reskilling fund that will provide free training to about approximately 700 residents in high demand career opportunities. $4.6 million for career coaches. These coaches will help our residents navigate the system and connect them to education, training, and employment opportunities in high demand industries. And then we'll also provide $500,000 for a workforce training program for our LGBTQ plus residents. In financial support and empowerment, we'll be providing $15 million for cash assistance to our excluded workers who are unable to access the unemployment insurance system. $26 million to provide laptops, tablets, and smartphones to some of our vulnerable populations, including seniors, residents in our homeless shelters, youth exiting foster care, families in TANF, and returning citizens. And nearly $4 million to expand our opportunity accounts, which provides a 4-to-1 match savings for residents who can save for things like college, continuing education, job training, or a first-time home purchase. Next, I also want to talk about some of our investments in our economic recovery for our businesses. We know our businesses were hard hit over the pandemic, and we have a series of investments for recovery and growth. The first investment is $58 million over 3 years to provide access to grocery stores and sit-down restaurants in Wards 7 and 8, including $3 million to increase our Nourish DC fund. $8.1 million in FY22 will go to increase funding for our Great Streets program and provide opportunities for commercial ownership opportunities for small businesses and support our Shop in the District app, which will help people learn how to shop at their favorite small and local business. $8 million will be provided for a bridge fund to help arts venues recover and fully reopen. There'll be $30 million over 2 fiscal years for a new employment center vitality and local job creation fund to help us attract high-quality employers with good jobs back to the downtown core. $2 million will be invested to double our investment in the Inclusive Innovation Equity Impact Fund. $14 million for enhanced placemaking in public space in some of our key bid areas such as Anacostia bid, the Southwest bid, and the Golden Triangle bid. $13 million to increase permitting and inspection capacity at the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs as we expect a flood of new applications as needs as the city reopens. We'll also be announcing several fee waivers and one-time tax cuts in this budget. So the first is we're going to have a permanent reduction of many of our business fees down to $99. These fees typically cost hundreds of dollars each year. For small businesses, it can make it hard to open. These will be permanently reduced to $99. We'll do a 2-year reduction of occupational and professional license fees down to $99. We are proposing a one-time cut to the paid family leave payroll tax in FY22. The paid family leave program has accumulated a significant fund balance. as we have started the collections, but we haven't seen the same level of uptake. With that surplus, we are proposing to make a number of investments, including funding for excluded workers, including funding for the new benefits I mentioned earlier, including funding for the fee reductions. But we also think it's fair to return some of that money to the businesses who have paid too much. So we are proposing to reduce the payroll tax in FY22 from 0.62% to 0.27%, which will allow businesses to keep $168 million in their pockets. We're proposing a 2-year waiver of taxi and limousine driver fees. This industry has been particularly hit hard by the pandemic, and as they try to come back, forgiving these fees will help them come back faster. And lastly, we're waiving DC government fees for community organizations who want to host their festival and other public events that have had to be put off in the pandemic in all of FY22. And now let me turn it to the mayor quickly before the city
I was
administrator.
just going to say, that's great news for DC festivals and neighborhoods to attract people to communities and continue to send the message that DC is open.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to walk through the final 2 areas that will conclude this presentation. The first one discusses and highlights investments in transportation and the environment and in environmentally friendly mobility, which includes $72 million to support healthier homes and schools through expanded weatherization and energy efficiency retrofits, lead paint and mold remediation, lead pipe replacement and drinking water filtration, and solar energy installations. $351 million for streetscapes, trails, and Vision Zero investments, including the DuPont Crown Park and a new South Capitol Street trail that will go to the DC border that adjoins National Harbor. $116 million for the K Street Transitway that will provide protected bus and bike lanes through downtown DC. $21 million for a new pedestrian and bicycle bridge connecting Berry Farm to the Anacostia Metro. $215 million for the replacement of the H Street Bridge, and $9 million to reclaim streets for public use through the creation of recurring monthly street closures, as well as a signature event, one-time open streets event in each ward, and a signature event on 7th Street, northwest from Florida Avenue to the Wharf. Now, out of this investment, we'll see 80 new Capital bike share stations, so every resident will have one within a quarter mile of their home, 3,500 new e-bikes, 30 miles of protected bike lanes, 17.4 miles of pedestrian and bicycle trails, and bus-only lanes and other initiatives to improve bus speeds and reliability that would include 50-plus priority bus routes throughout the entire city, in addition to the investments that will bring our streets, alleys, and sidewalks to a state of good repair by 2025. And finally, government operations. Let us not forget we still have COVID and we still be responding to the pandemic emergency. So we have set aside $75 million to support the ongoing testing, vaccination, isolation and quarantine, and PPE and other needs. And we also recognize the need for oversight and accountability with respect to the federal funds. So we're putting $9.5 million for oversight, including money with the Office of the Inspector General, as well as the CFO, increasing contracting and procurement, and establishing an evaluation team to assess the impact of some of the investments. In addition to that, we also have specific investments that reflect our values. $2.3 million to promote access to voting and implement the Restore the Vote Act. $1 million for the increase of the Immigrant Justice Legal Services grants. $200,000 for interpretation service. $100,000 for veterans and $50,000 for Asian and Pacific Islanders anti-hate education, and $1 million to support a community center for LGBTQ residents. In addition to all that, the mayor has funded fully the pay raise for Comps Unit 1 and 2 and members of ASME 2921, as well as a 2% cost of living adjustment for non-union employees, and directed our Office of Labor Relations and Collective Bargaining and my office to begin and proceed with negotiations with all of our unions that had their pay increases put on pause during the pandemic. This totals to a $17.5 billion budget that will be highlighted in investments we make throughout every agency in the city. Thank you, Mayor.
So, well, thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Kevin, as well for those presentations. And let me just finally say, Kevin ended with some appreciation I gave to all of our union representatives and the 25,000 people who work for us who took a pause for money that we owed them that they had negotiated with us while we worked through last year's budget. And I'm very pleased to say that we will be able to honor our commitments with this budget proposal. I also wanted to share with members of the council that last week I brought together our team members, representatives of many teams, to honor their work over the past year, and I want to again thank them. Are we able to go through a list? Let me see. No? Okay. I will share the list because I'm really proud of the work that they did. And Mr. Chairman, just finally, this is also the first time that the cabinet has been together, all together in person since the pandemic. So I wanted to welcome some new cabinet members as well. I think this is our first time where we're together, where I can congratulate Kevin on his appointment as the city administrator. Fire Chief Donnelly as the fire chief for the District of Columbia. Amber Hewitt as the district's first Chief Equity Officer. Welcome, Amber. Margaret Curie as the Chief Judge of the Office of Administrative Hearings. Everett Lott, I've appointed the DDOT Director. Everett, congratulations. Faith Gibson Hubbard, the Director of the Mayor's Office of Community Affairs. Dr. Francisco Diaz, the Chief Medical Examiner. Robert Conti, the Chief of the Metropolitan Police Department. Eugene Adams, the Mayor's Office of Legal Counsel. And I also want to thank a number of directors for stepping up to serve in an interim capacity. Christina Davis, the interim director of D.C.-DPW. Cleo Sabito, the director of OUC. Alexis Squire, Serve DC. Lindsay Apaya, DYRS. And Shauna Young, OSSI. And I should have also mentioned Chris Geltard, who is the acting Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice. So with that, Chairman, we're pleased to answer any questions.
I think I want to say, wow. So there have been a lot of changes in the past year.
It's been a lot of changes. It has been 50.
We ought to get together more frequently. I'm going to start with the first question, then I'll turn to members. And my first question is really simple. So your last slide was a $17.5 billion budget. What was the budget, I'm not sure for this year is as good as the year before in terms of how much?
Thank you for the question, Chairman. So the gross funds budget for FY22 is the $17.5 billion. That's an increase of about 3.9% over the FY21 approved gross funds budget of $16.9 billion. For local funds budget, it is $9.12 billion for FY22. This is a 4.9% increase over the FY21 revised budget. The majority of the increase in both the local and the federal budget, which is 70% and 85% respectively, is the use of federal stimulus funds.
Thank you. So let me turn to colleagues to see if they have questions. I kind of think I should go by seniority. I don't have the list in front of me. We'll see if I remember correctly. Councilmember Che?
Thank you very much, Mayor, and thank you for this budget. It looks not only to allow us to recover, but actually to reimagine and improve so many of the things that we've been doing. I just have one question, and it's basically for my own understanding. Given that we had, a need to dip into some of our reserves, could you just tell me what the state of the world is with respect to our reserves and where we stand vis-a-vis, prior COVID?
Absolutely, and I'm gonna ask Jenny to kind of walk you through where we are with each of the reserve funds.
Thank you for the question. So, as you know, we have 4 different reserves in the district, 2 federally mandated, 2 district mandated. Our federally mandated reserves are our contingency cash and our emergency reserve. Our emergency reserve remains untapped as it has throughout the pandemic. Our contingency cash reserve, we have used about $229 million so far. We have about $83 million remaining. The vast majority of this use, about 80%, has been to fund our ongoing COVID-19 response. This includes things for like testing, for tracing, for feeding, for all of those core services. Most of that funding will be repaid with federal public assistance money from FEMA, but since it's a reimbursement-based grant, we have to spend the money first and then get it back. There's about $60.4 million of the contingency cash reserve we use for non-COVID-19 expenses. Those are being fully repaid in the fiscal year 21 supplemental that we're submitting to the council. For the district mandated reserves, the cash flow and the fiscal stabilization reserve, the cash flow reserve remains in use as it has always been for our cash flow needs, so we've not used that for other purposes. Our fiscal stabilization reserve, when we submitted the budget to you all last year, you saw our use of the full $212 million available at that time, and we have plans to repay it over fiscal year 23 and 24. That has not changed. We still plan to fully repay the fiscal stabilization reserve at the end of fiscal year 24.
Thank you.
Councilmember Bonds, do you have any questions?
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you, Mayor, for a very robust budget that addresses many of the issues that we certainly have heard throughout the city. I'm not going to get up and do a happy dance as I proposed the other day at the at the press conference about the $400 million, but thank you very much for giving so much attention to the affordable housing needs in the city and putting money there, and money also to help with the training of individuals and money for our schools. I'm really excited with what you have done in this budget. I can't say that I can sign on 100% yet, but it may be coming. As the chairman said in his remarks, that it was a perfect budget, perhaps. I'll say also perhaps, once my colleagues and I have an opportunity to look it over. But thank you very, very much for making a generous use of our local dollars, it seems, as well as the federal monies that we have received. And I'm really ready to look into this so that we'll be ready on the 2nd of June to talk more definitively. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Councilmember. And you will notice, as you heard Jenny, we've made every attempt to invest in the full spectrum of housing. We want to serve and make sure that we're creating housing to move people out of homelessness. We want to invest in parts of our homeless services center that we know need more attention so that we can get people into stable situations and get them on the road to permanent housing. We also invest in home ownership, and I know that's important to you, to how we continue to build a strong middle class in the city, and home ownership is one path.
Indeed, and I would be remiss if I did not thank you profusely for the understanding that public housing truly matters, and we have to upgrade those facilities as quickly as we can. We had hoped for maybe 60 million, and you almost doubled it. So I'll do everything I can to hold on to the money and make sure that it's spent.
It's not personal. You can't hold on to the money personally.
Oh, no, I don't hold on to the money, but you know what I mean. Yeah, we know what we mean.
Councilmember McDuffie.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Madam Mayor, and your entire team. I know you all put an enormous amount of work into this budget, and there's a lot of good stuff that's in this budget, so I want to acknowledge that. One of the things that I obviously want to highlight is the $20 million that's in the budget for Cornell School. The folks at Cornell, I think, will be really happy to see that this has been funded. I think they'll probably be calling me, if they haven't already, trying to figure out how we move it up, but I think that it's good news for that community, and they definitely could use some good news. With respect to, just a couple questions. The federal funds sheet on slide 7, it looks like there's $29.8 million in FY21. We know that we got 755 that we would have gotten were, we treated fairly last year under the CARES Act. How much of this is going out immediately to businesses, and how do you all plan to use that funds, if there's anything you might be able to share with that?
You're talking about CARES funding?
Well, the 755 that we got, and I see that it's only 29.8 million for FY21 in this slide.
Jenny?
So, Councilmember, thank you for the question. So there are a variety of fund of investments, as you can see, that we are hoping the council will quickly approve as part of the 21 supplemental, so that we can get them out the door very, very quickly. For some of the funding for economic recovery, if you give me just 1 second. So some of that will be investments in the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs to start building up some of that capacity for permitting and inspection. Some of it will be an additional $1 million for the Inclusive Innovation Equity Fund.
Okay. Do you all, is any of the money that you have, or at least that you're considering for FY21 that hasn't gone out yet, will it go out in the form of grants?
For the Inclusive Innovation Fund, yes,
Okay.
but the arts funding also will be grants, the
Okay.
$8 million.
Okay. And then I also noticed, and I'm sure he'll spend some time on this, but just it stands out, the 9.5 in gun violence prevention for FY21.
That is a mixture of investments all across the portfolio for gun violence. So we want to start as quickly as possible in getting credible messengers hired, and getting some violence interruption specialists hired, and providing some community grants transportation. So what you'll see is a proportion of the investment that we need for 22 to begin to really accelerate some of that investment in 21. So it really runs the whole gamut.
Okay. Any more thought to between the OAG's, their implementation of the Near Act Secure Violence model, and the work that you all are doing with the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, as well as the work that you all are doing with the Gun Violence Prevention Director of the consolidations? Have you all given any more thought to that, Madam Mayor?
Well, certainly we are, what you'll notice in here is that we build our gun violence, and I did not also, there are a few people I did not mention, and I should mention Linda Harley Harper as the district's first gun violence director. Where's Linda? I should mention the appointment of John Falchicchio as the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development. And most importantly, I should mention Fitzroy Lee as the interim CFO for the District of Columbia. But we are, I have tasked Linda and her team with building the government apparatus around all of our violence prevention efforts, including working with the OAG, working with the Council Committee on Justice, as well as working with our ONE's office. So to build all of our apparatus around gun violence prevention office, and the investment in the blocks that we have identified as most likely to have violent acts.
Okay. One of the things that I think it really stands out to me, and I'm excited to see this, but the $2.2 million for temporary safe housing for residents involved in gun violence. It's a problem that I just had a meeting just last week after a few shootings in my ward where this issue keeps coming up, having folks return to the same communities where they're experiencing gun violence is something that we want to try to avoid. And so I'm so glad to see this. I'd love to, at some point soon, talk to Charles, talk to you all about how you plan to spend that $2.2 million.
Well, housing, as I mentioned to council member for housing, runs throughout these budget proposals, including in building blocks. And it also presents us with a challenge as leaders to make sure we can go in communities all across the District of Columbia and say we need housing for vulnerable residents.
Appreciate it. That actually, just one last question. On this, I've seen some really great increases in the investment in gun violence prevention. I do get concerned though when I see large numbers, and I wonder whether or not they're recurring dollars for some of these investments. It's probably a conversation for a later time. But looking at the 5.6 to create, the 110 dedicated employment opportunities, I'm assuming that's recurring. And then the 7.8 for additional violence interrupters, that's impactful. And I think it will be very impactful. And I'm hopeful that those things will continue into the future. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Silverman.
Thank you. Mayor Bowser, first thank you to you.
Thank you.
And to your cabinet and all DC government employees. I have to say it's great to be able to gather in person.
It is.
Once again.
Thank you.
As you said, this pandemic has hit some of our residents a lot harder than others. So this is probably not a surprising question for me, but we had almost 100,000 DC residents. We've had 200,000 people file for some type of unemployment compensation, but about half of those are district residents. Some of them have waited weeks and months to get their benefits, and they've gone into debt. So State DC certainly will help with their housing arrears, and thank you for the money for those who don't qualify for unemployment. But I have to ask you, what are we doing for those who have struggled economically these past 15 months? Some of them have asked for UI benefits, for example, not to be taxable. We tax unemployment. I think Virginia doesn't. Many states don't. They love the stimulus payment you made for PUA claimants. Is there anything like that in the budget?
We don't have a continued stimulus payment. You do know, of course, that there are additional unemployment benefits that have been made available by the federal government, which persist, in addition to a payment that also was a result of the American Rescue Plan that has been out for a couple of weeks. So we don't envision an additional stimulus payment.
Thank you, Councilmember Silverman. Councilmember Nadeau, if you have any questions.
Chairman, thank you. Mayor, congratulations. I'm thrilled to see so many great investments in housing and in people and in our small businesses. Can someone tell me about the the 750 new PSH supportive housing units, whether that is in addition to the federal emergency vouchers or that is part of that?
Council member, thank you for the question. That is part of that includes the federal vouchers. What we are doing is making sure also to fund the services that are needed to go with those vouchers, because as you know, the emergency federal vouchers did not come with service dollars for those to be PSH. So the individuals number, I think, includes about 550 of the federal vouchers, and the balance is in the families.
Okay. I also noticed a $5 million cut to ERAP and wanted to understand how that, what the thinking is there, and obviously there's probably some relationship with State DC, but if you could let us know the analysis and the understanding of, making sure we have enough funding for those who aren't eligible for State DC.
So the analysis there is that because we're getting so much of the federal money for rental assistance and utility assistance, we can reduce some of our local contribution and put that money towards other investments that aren't covered with such big federal block grants.
Okay. And so there's been some analysis as to who is not eligible for that, for those federal dollars?
So what we have done is we've looked at several different studies to try to estimate the need out there for people who need rental assistance. And there's enough funding in the state DC program to do that. There still is funding in ERAP and in other programs if for some reason they do not qualify for the federal assistance.
Thank you. Finally, I'm concerned by something that I see in the budget book related to Park Morton, which was our new communities program in Ward 1. Seems to indicate that we are leaving behind the new communities promise and making a change to the program. Is there anyone who can speak to that?
John?
So Park Morton, as you know, we've been working over the years to try to work with the residents to figure out if they wanted to stay on site, if they wanted to move to another site, or if they wanted a voucher. It's really come to the point where we need to make a decision on how we advance the project, and the way that we can advance the project is to make sure that we have housing for each and every family who is at Park Morton, and we'll do that by renovating the site.
I look forward to talking with you more about that proposal.
Thank you, Councilor Nadeau. Councilmember Allen, if you have questions.
Thanks. Let me start, Ms. Mayor, with a thanks. And I guess since we're all actually in the same room, just also thanks to you and to all the cabinet and all of our DC government employees, because it has just been a lot of hard damn work for the last 15 months. So our gratitude and appreciation to everybody who's been pulling long hours and working really hard for the city. So thank you.
Thank you.
We'll obviously have hearings where we dig into a lot more detail on the budget. A couple things I do want to note with appreciation and with things I think they're really great investments. And when we think about not just one time but sustained investments, you know, I want to note, for example, the investments for the alternative 911 response. The way that I'm reading this is it's not just a 1 year, but you've got a sustained investment for several years to work with DBH, DPW, with our OUC. I think that's fantastic, and I think that's going to be really meaningful and impactful, but I really like the fact that you're intentionally putting this and signaling this is an investment for multiple years, so thank you. I think that's really great. Similarly, with the gun violence prevention work, sustained funding to help make sure that these jobs and positions are being created, the gun violence prevention work itself is being sustained, and I just think that's fantastic and it's needed, but really glad to see that. I also want to note the pathways expansion I think is great. And the fact that it also seems to be, maybe not directly coupled, but seems to definitely have a direct connection to jobs on the other side, I think is really important and will help it be successful. So I wanted to note those and thank you for that. A couple of quick questions that I had were related to some of the education pieces here. On the school-based mental health investments, definitely support expanding that to the places where we don't see our school-based mental health. Should I read that, though, to also say that for the schools that have school-based mental health, we're trying to expand even more? Because we know we're going to be seeing so much mental health need come back in the fall with our students and families. So is this just expanding to the places that we already aren't at? Or is it also expanding some of the places that we are just because we're expecting more need?
So thank you for the question, council members. This allows us to expand into all the remaining schools. That level of expansion and how much services each school gets depends on the needs assessment done by DBH in the school. So I can't speak right at this moment to who would get what, but that would be an ongoing conversation. There are also some other smaller investments to provide additional support, particularly in the next couple of years for school-based mental health supports like additional crisis stabilization programs for youth, additional training for teachers through OSSI, additional Healthy Futures programming for our early childhood education centers. So there are other investments as well that complement that.
Okay, thank you.
And you're also going to see, council member, throughout, I've asked the team to fully explore the use of telehealth for mental health services. I think one thing that we've learned from the pandemic is people are adopting and accepting of telehealth services, and I think in the area of behavioral health, that will help us expand our capacity. We also think there's a kind of a spectrum of support where we need clinicians in some cases. In other cases, we need navigators and coaches. And so you will see that permeated, whether it's for housing or job counseling, throughout the budget as well.
Great, thank you.
And the mental health support for students too, it also includes some wellness support for our teachers. And you'll see that as well as a theme represented throughout this budget, support for trauma-informed services, not only for the community, but support for our government workers who have been on the front line throughout this pandemic.
I think that's really important, because yeah, they've certainly been on the front lines and absorbed a lot, so thank you. Another question I had, I was glad to see what looks like $26.5 million for devices. One of the things we've certainly seen, I know in Ward 6, but I think across the city as well, is that even when we have access, the capacity and bandwidth of that access is really uneven. So even when we get a device into a home and get them connected, they may not have the speeds and capacity for, you know, if you've got parents working at home, more than one kid doing virtual classes. Do you, and maybe it's a conversation in a hearing to kind of dig more into this, but do you envision that funding not just to be the device, but also to work on increasing that capacity so that there's just a broader bandwidth and capacity there?
I think that's more work we have to do, and I think that we have recognized and identified that people need devices to connect, and from homes we've been able to connect a lot of children, but you raise another good point. So we've connected children through their schools, but job seekers need help, people who need help to telemedicine need help as well. So we are very focused on what's happening federally on infrastructure to be able to address some more of those needs.
And IT is infrastructure.
IT is infrastructure.
I appreciate it. Last question I had was just related to, I guess, one of the decisions around federal funding for our schools. Did we end up deciding that when we look at our staffing and protecting a lot of the positions and expanding some of the needs within the individual schools, that we are using some of our federal dollars to be able to make sure that the librarians and the reading intervention and the supports are going to be funded through that?
Yes, so I believe the school communities have already had a direct communication from the chancellor about how the ESSER dollars will float to the schools. Our public charter schools got those dollars directly through OSSI for those additional funds.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Robert White.
Thank you very much to you, Madam Mayor, and to your team. There's a lot to be excited about in the budget. Many of the investments in housing, certainly a lot of investments in formerly incarcerated and formerly incarcerated residents, and particularly want to thank you for funding Restore the Vote. The funding for violence interruption, I think, takes us a long way, continues us down a very helpful and productive path. So lots of things in here that I think many of us are really excited to work with you and your team on. Just a couple questions on specifics on the $68 million for child care. How is that money going to be broken down, and will it help sort of protect and fortify some of our existing child care centers, and is it possible to revive some of those that may have closed during COVID?
Well, we share your interest. There were a lot of federal dollars that came in to support child care. The state superintendent has worked throughout to provide emergency funds. DC Health has worked hand in hand with them to provide guidelines. A number of our child care providers stepped up in the early days of the pandemic to provide child care for essential workers. So we need to get those seats back. We spent the last 5 budgets creating 1,000 seats across the district and improving quality in those child care centers. So we're very interested to get those back. Let me turn to Jenny to ask her to talk about specific investments.
Thank you, Mayor. So the investment of $68 million is made up of a variety of tools that we hope will help stabilize, grow the child care sector. So it includes $5 million of our Access to Quality grants. These are the grants that we've been giving out to to child care centers to help them purchase facilities and renovate facilities. It will include $8 million of new back-to-work child care grants. This will help facilities with some of the increased overhead costs that they've been experiencing get back open. It'll include $40 million of stabilization grants. This is part of the specific stabilization grant that came from the federal government. It will include $3 million for a new child care worker recognition and retention fund. So it will include $3 million for incentives for child care workers that stay on the job for more than a year to help, keep our workforce there. It'll also include $2.2 million to provide scholarships to child care workers who want to increase their credentialing. And then it will include $10 million for a subsidy stabilization. One thing that you won't see in 22, but will begin in 23, is a $9 million investment for a quality pay pilot, where we'll be looking at how can we really advance the pay of the child care workers in facilities tied to the subsidy rate.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And final question, we are continuing to hear, including in a hearing last night, concern from parents about losing positions at schools. There have been a lot of announcements about funding for schools, but there still seems to not be full clarity on whether some schools will lose staff. I know the funding shouldn't decrease, but with inflation, that may not cover the cost of staffing. So will we be able to keep all of the staff at every school?
Well, I don't want to talk about specific schools because I won't have all of that information from the chancellor, but our approach has been, and we always announce the school funding earlier than the rest of the budget to give our school leaders the chance to start their preparations. We've increased the per pupil funding formula by 3.6%. You, of course, know that that's tied to a student, and so the number of students at a school affects its total budget. The chancellor then has the ability to listen to school requests and invest additional dollars. This year, we have the increased federal dollars that are going towards that. So let me ask the chancellor to talk to you about, after all of that's done and approved, where each school community stands.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Treon.
Thank you. So as I echo, I want to thank you, Mayor Bowser, and your team. I'm very impressed by this budget. I think it's going to go a long way for the residents in the district. I guess I want to start off with one of the most vulnerable populations that have been dealing with a lot during this pandemic, and that's our senior citizens. And so I want to thank you for your commitment to them. One thing I am impressed about was the $6.9 million for internships for seniors. I hear a lot of seniors who are falling behind economically as the price of living in D.C. keep going up and up, and they're on fixed income. And I wanted to ask you, is this tied to the 50-plus program or to the Senior Community Service Employment Program? How do we plan on doing outreach to ensure that those dollars are getting to the seniors they can get more?
Well, thank you, Councilmember. You're right to focus. We know a lot of our seniors were already isolated before the pandemic, and this pandemic has increased social isolation. Seniors are providing care to grandchildren and to spouses. We have lost connection with our seniors who were going to wellness centers. So you will see in this budget ways to reduce that isolation, both in person, virtually, and otherwise. Let me ask Jenny to talk about you said the 50-plus program, and if we have anything that implicates that in the budget.
So we are expanding a variety of programs through DOES to provide all sorts of new job training slots and opportunities, including a lot of our federal programs that helps fund the 50-plus. I will have to get back to you, Councilmember, on exactly how many slots that's creating, though, for 50 plus.
Okay, thank you. And also, on education, we probably are going to see the most amount of learning loss we've ever seen in probably DC history. And while I'm impressed by the amount of money, in addition to the uniform per pupil student funding formula, I'm concerned about the $13 million investment into tutoring. I know we have ESSA, but I'm concerned that that's not enough to ensure that we are putting our dollars behind closing the achievement and learning gap in the district. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, let me assure you that we have put our best thinking around how to accelerate learning for children. And first and foremost, we have done across the government our level best to get kids back in person at their schools, with their peers, with their teachers, and in buildings that have been set up to facilitate their learning. And we continue to be focused on that. This summer, also, we have a huge program that is both fun and enriching. And so there will be students who are going to school. There will be students who are in summer camp, thousands of students in summer camp. And let me give a shout out to DPR and its staff as well, who have been very, very creative about in-person opportunities. So I have to say that, because they've been like, we want to get open because we want to see our kids, and they're doing great. And so there will be earn and learn opportunities for kids at DPR as well. I think we're at 13,000 kids in SYEP. There will be both in-person and hybrid experiences. Our entire cluster, led by Deputy Mayor Kine, has been focused on how all of those opportunities will help accelerate learning. So that not just getting into the next school year, but right now, for the summer, we're focused on accelerating learning.
Thank you. I also want to echo that I'm appreciative of the money that's been put in the budget for violence prevention that's needed, long been needed in the city. I do want to ask about the unemployment insurance and Stay DC. As you know, some of our residents are in some place where they're feeling depressed, left out, unengaged, and just not feeling like they're getting what they need. Is there any type of funding that's going to push to get more workers there to help relieve some of the stress on these agencies? I hear the director, Unique Merle Hughes, talk about the amount of pressure coming from the federal government with new regulations, which may slow down getting people their money. But there are people who haven't got their unemployment insurance in months, and so they're in dire need. Is there any emergency funds to get more staff to address that?
Council member, we have, the mayor has been investing in DOES using our federal stimulus funds, part of the $495 million that we first received, to add additional capacity to DOES. So we've added additional call takers, we've added additional adjudicators. We've also added improvements to the overall website itself for communication purposes. We do know that the system does need an overhaul, and there is money in the capital budget to do that. As you noted, it's just been an incredible amount of work thrown on the Department of Employment Services. And that funding to expand their capacity continues in this fiscal year.
And what about Stay DC to cover back rent?
Stay DC, I'm sorry?
Yes, I get a lot of calls in my office that people fill out their Stay DC applications, but have got no responses from the government.
Yep. So one of the things we're working with the Department of Human Services on is making sure that we do step up the number of people who are reviewing. So what we want to do is make sure that with the resident applies, that they are getting a quick response. If the housing provider does the application first and the resident has to respond, we still need the resident to respond in order to process it. So with Stay DC, one of the things that just want to highlight is that we need to make sure that if a resident applies, that we get to that application quickly. If the housing provider applies, we need the resident to apply as well. Otherwise, we can't process the application. So we'll keep working to make sure we inform folks about that. But all the application reviews, once they're complete, we're going to work with the Department of Human Services to make sure that we're getting through those reviews quicker.
Thank you. One last question. United Medical Center is there. No, we are in a conundrum as it relates to that. Is there any thoughts or budget-wise about additional funding for United Medical Center outside of the receivership?
Kevin?
We will continue to provide funding to it, and our emphasis is on opening up the new hospital in 3 years. So we will be working with and responding to the new control board and identifying the funding needs that they deem for UMC. And that will become clearer as the coming months and the control board.
So I have to say something to that, because you know the control board is going to cut, and we're talking about 3 years, as you mentioned, for a population that has the highest health disparities in the district east of the Anacostia River. I'm concerned that we are not being proactive about putting money there to ensure that we can keep the hospital not just open, but vibrant, because a lot of seniors, that's their primary care physicians, et cetera, at their hospital.
Councilmember, let me assure you of this, that we will put before you what we need, and there are certain policy decisions that have been made by the council, and we will continue to work on keeping a full-service quality hospital open until we get the new hospital open. If we have to come back to you and share with you the decisions that this board, and the control board is kind of a misnomer because these are all kind of our local people, so I want to be clear about that. It's a mechanism that was created locally, but it will likely force some tough decisions around personnel.
Thank you.
Council member, I just wanted to highlight one on your question about high impact tutoring. I actually wanted to provide some more context to it. So the $13 million that you identified is funding for FY22 in what we're building as a central capacity to be able to serve students across both the public and charter school. That will recur throughout over the next 3 fiscal years to be $41 million for this central capacity. Now, what's not stated there is the direct school funding that both individual schools and the charter and public schools get. And we expect, based on their spend plans, that they will at the school level supplement the central capacity, and we project the high impact tutoring at that school level to be about at or above $100 million over the financial plan with this school-based work. So the central funding that we identify here is just one part of a larger amount that will come out of these school-based spending plans for the direct school federal grants. So just to give you a broader perspective to the depth of the investment.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Pinto?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you so much, Mayor, and to your entire team for the amazing amount of work that has gone into this. Somebody who joined the council almost 1 year ago, it's pretty remarkable having the opportunity to see many of you in person for the first time. Oh, yes. And I am thrilled to be having this meeting in Ward 2 at the MLK Library, so thank you for that. I wanted to ask, on slide 7, there was a breakdown of some of the federal aid received. Mm-hmm. Which of these categories were mandatory pursuant to the federal guidelines versus our own demonstration of our priorities if the guidelines were a bit broader?
Yeah, so the guidelines allow for a couple broad uses, and they're certainly more expansive than they were under the previous $495 million. I would say we were able to fit the vast majority of our investments were allowable under the guidelines. Those that we could not fit were things that we were allowed to pay for with the revenue replacement allowability portion. There is a specific formula that calculates how much you can use and what it would go to. But some examples of things that we felt were important that were not included in the federal guidance would be a lot of PAYGO funding for some capital projects that we really wanted to advance. The federal stimulus was really limited to water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure for capital uses. And so we did use some funding for PAYGO to do a lot of the transportation and environment initiatives that you heard about. But the vast majority of things that we wanted to do were allowable uses.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm thrilled to see the $67 million investment, particularly for permanent supportive housing vouchers, which have proven to be so effective for our neighbors experiencing homelessness. Is there a piece of that that includes an expansion of outreach workers to directly connect neighbors experiencing homelessness to these services and opportunities?
So there is $1.8 million in the budget to continue the outreach work that the Department of Human Services contracts with a lot of our community-based organizations to provide. There's also a new investment in the Department of Behavioral Health that I believe is just under $2 million, which is going to support a new team there for intensive care coordination to really do the outreach to those individuals that have become just really disconnected from care.
And also the investments that we're making in the single system, we think will continue to help us get people off the street. While the pandemic and as the public health emergency wanes, we think that we will also build in more capacity at our homeless shelters. I have to tell you how just incredibly proud I am of all of the work of our Emergency Operations Center and the Department of Human Services, because going into this pandemic, we were incredibly scared about what could happen in our congregate settings, including the homeless shelter, including DC jail, and a lot of people were very smart at keeping our residents safe.
Thank you. I echo that gratitude. On slide 15, it highlights a $30 million investment for new employment center vitality and local job creation funds. How do you envision that being implemented and working in practice?
Well, as we have discussed, council member, and it's apropos that we're in the kind of the heart of the city right now in downtown Washington. And many people have the experience that I have when I come to downtown Washington. I'm just sad because there's nobody here. And we have been able, because people have made a lot of sacrifices to crush this virus, to lift restrictions, make sure our office buildings are open and workers can return safely, people can use the metro safely and come back to work. But what I think we'll find, and all employers will go through this, is that there's going to be a new way to work. And people will make different decisions about leased space, about how much they need, if they need any. Should they stay in the center city? Should they go to a suburb? Should they go to an entirely new region? So this budget includes a amped up economic development effort to attract employers, to retain the employers that we have, and to make sure that we stay competitive within this region, but also in regions across the country that are trying to lure our employers. So there are a couple specific examples of projects that are out there. But there are others that I'm sure that I want to make sure our DEMPED team, our bid teams who are out there recruiting all the time have at their disposal.
Thank you. And then just lastly, do you all have the total dollar amount in front of you for the Jelliff Recreation Center investment?
Yeah. With the $7 million they currently have, we'll add 23 for a total of $30 million.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Henderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always fun going last. Don't worry, people. I will be very short. Madam Mayor and to the rest of the team, there's a lot here, to be grateful for in terms of what you put on the table, and obviously the devil are in the details, but so far it's looking really good, and I just want to express my gratitude in terms of the investments into maternal health, which, as you know, is a big priority of mine, as well as school-based mental health and some of those other things. And I think that there's a lot here, too, that might get overlooked. For instance, the reduction in business fees, which a lot of there are a lot of residents who their side hustle had to become their main hustle.
Amen.
And so, cutting those fees and some of those things, I think will help a lot of folks. I wanted to ask just a couple of really quick questions. So, I noticed the $58 million to expand grocery stores and restaurants, sit-down restaurants in Wards 7 and 8 over the next 3 years, and I was just curious in terms of what does that mean? are those grants? Is that tax incentives? What is that?
Sure. Let me say a little bit, and I sent a quick note to Councilmember Che, who has been very focused on food and food security across the district, and has worked, I know, many years on making that so. As well as Councilmember Trayon White and Councilmember Gray have also been very solidly focused on how we can make sure that there are more opportunities for good quality food in all neighborhoods in the district. I frequently say to people, I can go places in Ward 1 and Ward 2, throw a rock and hit 5 grocery stores. I mean, like that. And so in other wards, including the one I live in, by the way, you can't throw a rock and hit 5 grocery stores. You definitely can't do it in Ward 8. You can't do it in Ward 7. So I've asked DMPED, and I'll ask John to speak to this a little bit, to be very focused on using all of our economic development power to attract grocery. And that includes our leasing power. Where can the district be to attract more daytime workers, to attract more retail? So John, if you would talk a little bit about the $58 million.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mayor. So this fund would actually be a couple of different programs all in one. There's one particular site in Ward 7 that we need to actually liberate, and that's on East Capitol Street. We need to make sure that we actually have what is there, which is a retail pad to actually have a grocery store, actually has the capital investment that it needs to bring that to fruition. There are some steps we have to take in order to, like I said, liberate it, because there is a lease in place. So we need to take some steps on that. We'll do that and advance that. But we really need to deliver a supermarket at that site. So that is a real driver of this. In addition, we also have a couple of programs that you're probably familiar with, like the Neighborhood Prosperity Fund, like Nourish DC, and some others, where we're actually making sure that food retailers have the resources they need through grants to get their business started or propel it. And one of the things the mayor's challenged us on is to think about food retailers or restaurants that are in maybe this part of the city, but not in the east part of the city, and how do we actually encourage them to expand east, or to find retailers and food and restaurants that are east already, and to figure out how they can get another location. So we're going to be working on that with this budget as well. And so those are kind of some of the approaches that we'll take through this budget. But we also have another item that's not listed here that we talked about last week, and that's a Tiff at Northeast Heights, which is a $50 million Tiff that will send the legislation to the council, hopefully before the recess, in order to advance the project at Minnesota and Benning Road. And that will be a replacement for the supermarkets that is there. Councilman Gray has been adamant that we need a new supermarket there, and so we're happy to support that in addition to the number that you see here.
Great. I also noticed this very large investment in Vision Zero, which I think is going to make a lot of people really excited here. My question is whether or not some of this funding will hopefully start in FY21 as opposed to just having to wait until October.
Yes, so earlier, I don't remember when that was now, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago, we talked about safety initiatives that could be implemented this summer. Jenny will remind me of the dollar amounts that DDOT was able to find so that we could begin those. One of the big efforts includes how we redeploy or employ additional speed cameras throughout the city. So we continue to work on that. We also have the policy matter that will continue to advance of having DDOT be responsible for that.
Yes, the total investment is about $10 million. About half of it is advancing livability study work. So these are small physical improvements to different intersections and corridors.
So there's no additional beyond the 10?
Not for this summer.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. And then finally, I just wanted to ask about the safe passage. We had a hearing last night talking with some Ward 7 and 8 families. And while I certainly appreciate the funding here in terms of the micro-transit routes, I'm hopeful that we can expand that to not just within Ward 7 and 8, because as you know, we have a lot of young people and families who are nervous about their travel west, who they live in Ward 7 and 8, but they're nervous about the safe passage to perhaps, Eastern High School or, other places across the city. So I look forward to those conversations with the Chancellor and Deputy Mayor. But thank you so much, Madam Mayor.
Yeah, so I think it's important to note we're going from 0 to $6.3 million, going from not having any dedicated transit for children and families who need it to 23 school locations. So I hope that's not lost in the conversation. Thank you.
I think that's all the council members. I want to say going from 0 to 60, but I guess it was 0 to 6.
0 to 6.3.
Yes. All the council members have had an opportunity to ask questions. As I said before, you will be presenting this more formally to the council next week, June 2nd, I believe at noon, and members will have an opportunity.
Where will I be for that presentation?
I believe it's a virtual hearing.
Okay.
So depending upon what Zoom background you have, you could be anywhere.
Okay, it could be wherever I want.
Correct.
Okay.
But I wouldn't have Mexico in the background. That might not play well.
Okay. Very good.
Thinking of a former senator. As I said at the beginning, this starts a 54-day process for us between today and first reading on July 20th. And the committee hearing schedule has already been posted on the council's website. I want to thank you again, Mayor Bowser, for really putting forward the idea of our meeting in person and meeting here at the library. And I think this has been very productive. Look forward to the next 54 days. Well, not really, but I look forward to the next 54 days as we iron this out and approve a $17.5 billion budget.
Amen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, council members.